These three disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories about feral people encounters are inspired by real events. You'll hear the harrowing experiences of a desperate runaway, a watchful grandfather, and a woman living alone who learned that a chain-link fence offers no protection from what was already waiting in her own backyard. We'll begin with a woman fleeing a dangerous cult who discovers that the clicking, spider-like things hunting her in the hollows are far deadlier than the men she left behind. Then, we follow the chilling realization of a grandfather who discovers his grandson's imaginary friends are actually silent, mud-caked humans watching them from the tree line. Finally, we witness the nightmare of a homeowner who steps into the woods to find her dog, only to interrupt a savage feeding frenzy by neighbors that never learned to be human. The most terrifying sound in the world isn't a scream. It's the wet snap of a bone breaking in the dark. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. The Appalachian forest did not feel like freedom. It felt like a mouth that had just swallowed her whole. Emma ran until her lungs burned. She did not look back, but she knew exactly what was behind her. 8 years of the covenant, 8 years of silence and heads bowed low. Behind her was the chaos of the cleansing ceremony, the flickering torchlight, and the angry shouts of men who viewed her not as a person, but as lost property. In her hand, she clutched the cult's only link to the outside world, a heavy, blocky cell phone. She squeezed it so tight her knuckles turned white. It was no longer just a device. It was her only hope. From the hollows behind her, the voice of Vernon, the head guard, echoed off the trees. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, controlled, and terrifyingly loud, promising safety if she would just stop running. She didn't answer. She found a shallow cave hidden by ferns and curled into a ball. She pressed the button on the phone, praying for a miracle. The screen lit up, casting a ghostly blue light on her dirty face. The words in the corner were a punch to the gut. No service. The first night was a blur of human fear. She listened to the heavy boots of the cult members crashing through the brush, hunting her like a deer. But as the second day broke, gray and wet, the atmosphere in the woods shifted. The shouting stopped. The heavy crashing ceased. A silence fell over the mountains that was heavier than the dark. Emma was moving through a dense patch of birch trees when she realized she wasn't alone. 50 yards back, through the mist, she saw them. 2 figures standing still. Tall, shoulders hunched. Her heart stopped. She was certain it was Vernon. She prepared herself to surrender. She watched the figures, waiting for them to shout. But then, the figures moved and Emma's understanding of the world shattered. They didn't walk. They dropped. Smoothly, silently, the 2 figures fell forward onto their hands. Their limbs bent at sharp, impossible angles, their backs arching high. They looked like giant, pale spiders. Emma blinked, sure that hunger was making her hallucinate. But the figures scrambled forward on all fours, moving with a fluid speed no human could mimic. One of them lifted its head, sniffing the air. Even from a distance, she saw the face was wrong, too flat with dark holes where a nose should be. This wasn't the fear of punishment. This was the fear of being eaten. She bolted. Behind her, a sound erupted that did not belong to any man. Click-clack. A sharp, wet sound, like stones striking bone, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of paws tearing up the earth. She ran until her vision blurred, scrambling up a steep ridge to escape the clicking things in the hollow below. She survived the night only by staying high in the rocks, listening to the forest floor come alive with sounds she couldn't identify. By the late afternoon of the third day, she stumbled onto a gravel logging road. Her legs were shaking, her body pushed beyond its limit. She pulled the phone out one last time. 1 bar. She dialed the number she had memorized a lifetime ago. When her brother Reuben answered, his voice sounded like it was coming from another planet. Calm, casual, safe. Emma couldn't make him understand. She tried to explain the cult, the escape, and the things in the woods, but her voice was a ragged shred of panic. Reuben, confused and firmly rational, dismissed her talk of monsters. To him, she sounded manic. He just wanted a location. She looked down the darkening road. In the distance, a square yellow light glowed against the twilight. A sign. She told him she saw Ruby's Roadhouse, the old diner off the highway. Reuben told her to go there to sit inside and that he was coming to get her. She started to walk toward the light. It was a beacon. It was the end of the nightmare. But then came the sound. Click-clack. It was right behind her ear, intimate, wet. She could smell the creature now, a thick metallic scent of old copper and wet musk. She didn't look back. She screamed into the phone that they were still there, that she was running to the door, that she could see the gas pumps. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of limbs hitting the gravel behind her, closing the distance with unnatural speed. Then chaos. Reuben heard the phone fumble, the wind rush over the microphone, and a harsh clatter as the device hit the pavement. He screamed her name, but there was no answer. Only the sound of static and faint, heavy breathing that sounded like air being sucked through wet, slotted nostrils. Then the line went dead. Reuben drove like a madman, his siren wailing into the night. He pulled into the gravel lot of Ruby's Roadhouse 20 minutes later, his service pistol drawn. The diner was quiet. The warm lights hummed. Inside, the few patrons looked up in surprise as he burst through the door, shouting his sister's name. The waitress Ruby looked at him with tired eyes. When he described the girl in the gray hoodie, Ruby nodded. She had seen her. According to Ruby, she had looked out the window 20 minutes ago. She saw a girl matching that description stumbling near the gas pumps. But then, Ruby said, a car had pulled up, a dark, older model sedan with no lights on. She saw the girl hesitate, then open the back door and get inside. Ruby assumed it was her ride. She watched the car peel out of the lot, disappearing down the dark highway. Reuben ran back outside to the pumps. He found the phone lying face down in the dirt, the screen cracked but still glowing. He shone his flashlight on the ground, his mind racing to find a logical explanation. The evidence was there, but it didn't fit. There were indeed tire tracks. Fresh rubber burned onto the asphalt, screeching away from the pumps. It confirmed the waitress's story. Someone had taken her. But in the soft mud right beside where the car door would have been, there was something else. Reuben knelt down. He was a cop. He knew what boot prints looked like, but these markings were wrong. Pressed deep into the mud, alongside Emma's boots, were strange, elongated depressions. They looked like handprints, but the placement was impossible. Too wide, too aggressive. The fingers were unnaturally long, and at the end of each digit, the mud was gouged deep, as if something with hard, sharp nails had clawed at the earth for traction. Reuben stood up, shining his light into the darkness. He didn't believe in monsters. He didn't believe in feral things in the woods. He believed in kidnappers, in cults, in bad men doing bad things. But as he stood there in the silence of the Appalachian night, clutching his sister's broken phone, he couldn't reconcile what he saw. The tire tracks said one thing, the claw marks in the mud said another. He didn't know if the car was a rescue or a trap. and looking at the strange, deep gouges in the dirt for the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. Reuben stared down the empty highway, then back at the silent, watching woods. He never saw Emma again. All he had left was the static. Reuben never got his answer. And if you go looking in those mountains, statistically, neither will you. The Appalachian wilderness is a beautiful place to disappear. Did you know the National Park Service historically hasn't kept a single public database of the missing? It is a silence as deep as the woods itself. In cases just like Emma's, where people vanish into thin air, 44.5% of the victims are never found. Not a bone, not a shred of clothing. Even K9 units, dogs bred to track the impossible, fail to find a scent in 81% of these unexplained cases. They spin in circles, they whimper, they refuse to go into the hollows. Skeptics will tell you it's just human predators. They will cite the 13 documented murders on the trail since 1974, warning you about bad men who use the isolation as a weapon. But when the dogs can't find a scent, and the tracks defy human logic, you have to look at the gaps in the data. The locals know what fills those gaps. They know that in the deep, unexplored valleys, civilization is just a suggestion. So go ahead. Plan your trip. But remember the numbers. When you step off the trail in Appalachia, the odds aren't just that you'll get lost. The odds are you'll be hunted. They say the Appalachian woods are old, but they don't tell you they are hungry. Most people think they know the difference between a child playing pretend and something else. But for a grandfather named Buster, the line between innocent play and true horror dissolved the day his 8-year-old grandson Boone stepped out of the tree line. It wasn't just that Boone was dirty. Any boy can get dirty. It was the kind of dirt. He was coated in a thick, aggressive black mud that smelled like crushed pine needles and unwashed animal hide, a smell that no little boy should have. And when he looked at his grandfather, his eyes were too wide, too still. He didn't look like a child who had been playing. He looked like prey that had learned how to become a predator. Buster should have packed the car right then. He should have driven them back to the city until the tires smoked. But he didn't. He stayed. And because he stayed, he learned what was really living in those woods. Buster had brought Boone to the cabin for a quiet summer. It was a month-long stay, miles away from the noise of the city. For Buster, it was a chance to catch up on his own life. He spent his days in the detached garage, the smell of sawdust filling the air as he worked on his woodworking projects. In the evenings, he sat in his recliner with a stack of papers and the low hum of the TV keeping him company. He was happy to let Boone roam. It kept the boy busy. "Can I go explore, Bus? Boone would ask, tugging on Buster's sleeve while Buster measured a piece of cedar. "Go ahead, Booney," Buster would say, not looking up from his saw. "Just be back before the shadows get long." And Boone always came back, but every time he returned, he was changed. The corruption began with the dirt itself. It was sticky and dark, like grease, and coated the boy's legs in layers. But it was the smell that made Buster wrinkle his nose. When Boone walked past him, he didn't smell like sweat and sunshine anymore. He smelled acrid and wild, like wet fur and old earth rotting in the damp. Then came the stories. It happened over dinner one humid evening. "They teach me things, Bus," Boone said, casually pushing peas around his plate with dirty fingernails. "About the woods." Buster looked up from his newspaper, smiling. "Who does?" "My friends. They live in the deep part, past the creek." Buster chuckled. "Well, imaginary friends are the best kind. They never argue with you and they don't eat all the snacks." Boone stopped eating. He looked up, his eyes wide and serious. "They aren't imaginary, Bus. They're just shy. They don't like coming out where it's open." "Sure, kid," Buster said, turning the page of his paper. "Just don't get lost looking for them." As the weeks went on, Buster stayed busy with his routine. He sanded his cabinets, watched his westerns, and drank his coffee. He noticed Boone acting strange, standing too still in the yard, moving silently through the house. But he chalked it up to the boy just being weird. Kids do strange things when they're bored in the woods. One afternoon, Buster was on the porch when Boone flowed out of the tree line like smoke. He stopped at the edge of the yard and raised his hand. It wasn't a normal wave. It was slow and deliberate, moving side to side in a strange, ritualistic rhythm. "Boone," Buster called out, chuckling. "What kind of wave is that? You looking for aliens?" Boone didn't laugh. "That's how we say 'I see you.' It means, 'I am here and I am harmless.' Your friends taught you that?" "Yes," Boone said. "They're waiting for me, Bus. They want to meet you." Buster shook his head, amused. "Maybe later, kiddo. Grandpa's got to finish this varnish." The end of summer approached. It was the very last day before they had to head back to the city. Buster was packing up his tools in the garage when Boone ran in. The boy was electric with energy. His eyes were bright, and he grabbed Buster's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Come on, Bus," Boone pleaded. "You have to meet them. It's the last day. They know you're the one who lets me stay. I told them you'd come." Buster sighed. He looked at the half-packed box of tools. He looked at his coffee mug steaming on the bench. He really just wanted to finish packing and sit down. "Boone, I'm busy," Buster said. "Please, Bus," Boone whispered. "Just for a minute." Buster looked at his grandson's hopeful face and relented. All right, fine. Let's go see this fort of yours." Buster wiped his hands on a rag and followed Boone out of the garage. He wasn't scared. He expected to walk a mile, look at a pile of sticks that Boone called a castle, say "good job," and come back for dinner. Boone led him away from the safety of the cabin. They walked past the familiar trails. They went deeper, pushing through thick brush that snagged on Buster's clothes. "You really went this far out?" Buster grunted, swatting a branch away from his face. "If your mother knew I let you go this deep, she'd kill us both." The trees grew taller and closer together here. The canopy blocked out the sun, turning the afternoon light into a dim gray twilight. The ground under their feet changed. It was no longer hard dirt. It was spongy and soft. Finally, they reached a small clearing. It was a hidden pocket in the oppressive density of the pines. "Okay, Booney," Buster said, putting his hands on his hips and looking around the empty space. "Where are they? Did they go home for dinner?" Boone let go of Buster's hand. He walked to the center of the clearing and pointed toward the far side, where the shadows were deep and black. There was no sound, no bird calls, just a heavy silence. "They're shy," Boone whispered. Buster rolled his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips. He was about to make a joke about how shy friends are convenient when you don't want to share toys. Then, about 100 yards away, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged from the darkness of the tree line. Buster's smile froze. His brain tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He thought maybe it was a trick of the light or an old stump. But the stump moved. It was roughly the shape of a man, but it stood in a way that was unnervingly low, almost hunched over. The figure was coated in earth. It looked like it had been rolled in mud and leaves. It wore rags that hung off its body in tattered strips. blended with tangled animal hides that looked stiff and old. Its head was bowed low. The face was completely hidden behind a curtain of long matted hair that looked like wet, dead grass. It stood as still as a stone, facing them. Buster felt the blood drain from his face. The joke died in his throat. This wasn't a pile of sticks. This wasn't a game. He was looking at a person, a wild, feral person who had been living in the dirt, watching his grandson for weeks. The figure slowly, deliberately raised one hand. It was a dark hand, calloused and caked in dried mud. The figure held its palm out and executed the wave. It was the exact same slow, rhythmic motion Boone had done on the porch. Side to side. I see you, I am here. In that horrifying instant, Buster's reality shattered. The papers, the woodworking, the TV shows, it all felt like a dream he had just woken up from. Boone hadn't been playing. He had been learning to survive from something that had forgotten how to be human. Boone didn't seem to notice that his grandfather had turned into a statue. He squeezed Buster's hand again, beaming with pride. He pointed a small finger directly at the silent, filthy thing standing in the woods. In a clear, happy voice that sounded completely out of place in the suffocating gloom, Boone spoke. "Those are my friends, Bus, right there." Buster could only stare as the figure lowered its hand and melted back into the shadows, silent as a grave. The woods were quiet again, but the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a heavy, monstrous lie. Buster grabbed Boone's hand and pulled him back toward the house, dragging the boy away from the dark, wet places of the woods and the things that watch from the trees. The Appalachian Mountains are not just a landscape, they are a presence. To outsiders, they are scenic rolling hills, but for those who live in their deepest folds, they are silent giants. They hold their secrets close, burying them under miles of damp moss and dense pine. If you live close enough to that tree line, you learn to respect the border. You learn that there is the world of paved roads and electric lights, and then there is the world that belongs to the woods. For Dolly, that border was defined by the chain-link fence that wrapped around her small, rural home. It was a simple silver mesh against a wall of green, but it represented safety. Beyond that fence, 200 yards of dense, unforgiving forest began. That forest was where the normal world ended. Dolly was 34, and her life was structured, predictable, and quiet. She worked in the city, surrounded by noise, and she came home to the silence. Her one true companion in this isolation was Virgil, a golden retriever whose loyalty was as thick and warm as his fur. Virgil had free roam of the backyard. It was his kingdom, a space Dolly considered entirely safe because she had secured it, a space she believed was hers. When she drove up the long gravel driveway at 6 p.m., the late afternoon sun was already sinking, pulling the light out of the deep valley. She parked the car, the engine ticking as it cooled. She noticed the back gate immediately. It was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the cool evening breeze, the metal latch clicking softly against the post. That was the first prick of unease, a cold, small stone dropping into her stomach. Dolly was meticulous. She lived alone. She had to be. She always made sure that gate was latched. She climbed out of the car, keys clutching tight in her hand. She called out, expecting the usual thunder of paws. "Virgil! Come on, boy, time for dinner!" Her voice sounded thin against the sudden quiet of the yard. There was no bounding golden blur, no happy thump-thump-thump of a tail against the deck, just the wind in the trees. Dolly checked the house, then went back to the deck, her mind frantically searching for a rationalization. Had she forgotten to latch it? No, She recalled the metallic clack of the lock perfectly. As the shadows deepened, turning the tree line into a wall of black, Dolly realized the truth. Virgil was gone. She called his name again, panic tightening her chest. This time she waited. She listened. The forest was absolutely silent. The crickets had not yet started their evening song. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then she heard it. A sound so thin it could have been a memory. A faint, distant barking. It wasn't the happy bark of a dog chasing a squirrel. It was rhythmic, urgent. And it was coming from deep inside the forest, beyond the property line, about 200 yards back. Dolly grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight. She walked to the fence line, heart hammering against her ribs. She pushed past the loose gate, wincing as the dry, splintering creak of the old metal hinge sounded incredibly loud in the silence. She stepped through the boundary. She stepped off the manicured grass and onto the soft, uneven floor of the wilderness. The light from her porch faded instantly, swallowed by the canopy. She was alone in the gloom. She was no hiker, but the signs were clear. Virgil was a large dog, and he had been dragged. There were broken branches, a clear path of disturbed leaves, and deep claw marks in the soft dirt. Her flashlight beam bounced frantically, illuminating flashes of brown leaves and gray trunks. Dolly kept calling, "Virgil, I'm coming, buddy!" The distant barking came again, short and desperate. It confirmed she was going the right way, but the tone made her skin crawl. It sounded terrified. Then the barking stopped. Abruptly, it didn't fade. It was cut off. The silence that followed was dense, absolute, and unnatural. Dolly stopped. She stood frozen in the underbrush, breathing raggedly, listening for anything normal. But she heard nothing. The forest had gone dead quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. She pressed onward, fear changing from panic to a creeping, suffocating dread. She felt exposed, small. Her flashlight beam barely cut through the thick blackness. She pushed through a thicket and came to a small circular clearing. In the center was a huge old oak tree, its thick roots exposed like gnarled fingers. The air here was strangely still, and there was a smell, thick, metallic, warm. It was impossible to mistake the coppery tang of fresh blood. Dolly raised her light. 2 figures were crouched at the base of the tree. They were barefoot. Their skin and tattered clothes were the color of mud and dead leaves, blending perfectly with the forest floor. They were hunched over something wet and dark between them, tearing into it with their hands and teeth. There was no fire, no tools, just the wet, rhythmic slapping sound of primal feeding, the sound of meat tearing. Dolly froze. The flashlight beam shook violently in her hand. Beside the figures, partially concealed by a root, she saw it. Virgil's distinctive red collar, ripped, lying in the dirt, stained black with blood. As she stared, a tremor of motion passed through the figures. Slowly, unnervingly. They stopped feeding. They didn't stand up. They didn't run. They simply craned their necks up, in unison. Blood covered their mouths and chins, glistening in the harsh LED light. Their eyes were wide, dark voids that reflected the beam without a trace of human expression. They made direct, unblinking eye contact with Dolly. But they did not stop the motion entirely. Their hands continued to pull strips of raw meat from the dark mass, and their jaws continued to chew, slowly, deliberately. One figure reached down and picked up a large white bone. It was thick and heavy. As Dolly watched in frozen horror, the figure raised the bone to its mouth. It never looked at the bone. It kept its eyes locked on hers. With a terrifying wet crack, the figure bit down, breaking the bone open to get to the marrow. Dolly didn't scream. She couldn't. The sound died in her throat, choked off by a terror so primal it paralyzed her. She started to back away. Her feet shuffled through the dead leaves. She took one step, then another. The figures remained motionless, squatting in the gore, chewing, their inhuman, vacant eyes locked onto her face. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by her own ragged breathing and that wet, grinding chewing sound. She turned and ran. She crashed through the thick underbrush, branches whipping her face, drawing blood she didn't feel. She heard no sound of pursuit, no footsteps, no shouting, but she felt it. The prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the cold certainty of being watched. She ran until her lungs burned, until the silver mesh of the fence came into view. She slammed the back gate shut, the latch clicking with a finality that felt pathetic against what she had just seen. She bolted the door. Inside, panting, Dolly leaned against the locked door and slid to the floor. She sat in the dark kitchen, staring out at the black void of the forest beyond. She was home, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not safe. The worst realization wasn't the death of her dog. It was the sudden, cold certainty that these things had been living 200 yards from her property this entire time. They hadn't traveled from miles away. They hadn't wandered in by chance. They were already there. They had simply reached out a hand. Virgil hadn't been an intruder. He had been dinner. And the unsettling fact was, the fence wouldn't keep them out. It had never kept them out. Dolly stared into the darkness, forever haunted by the image of that broken bone, asking herself the final question. How many times had they stood at the edge of the trees, watching her walk into her own backyard, seeing not a human neighbor, but just a meal,